Good evening once again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest episode of No2Nato. My name's Pete Higgins. You may remember me from such episodes as number 34, an episode that was described by one YouTube commentator as the greatest podcast I've ever heard in my life. High praise indeed, but I think those of you who listen to it with us will agree entirely justified. We'll continue in that vein tonight, and our subject this evening is NATO at The Hague. Not for their litany of war crimes, of course, and unfortunately, but for their annual meeting on June 25th. A number of points will suffice to summarise the content of the meeting. One was that the resulting communiqué issued by NATO was one of the shortest that they have ever released for any of their meetings. Only 5 points, 2 of them about money, and 1 simply to thank the Netherlands for hosting the summit itself. It was in the end the US objective that prevailed, that Europe increase its military spending to 5% of each individual nation's GDP, to compensate, of course, for Captain America's protective shield around the continent. The German government, led by Chancellor Friedrich Merz, has pledged an astonishing 650 billion euros over the next 5 years to their military. This was an amount that even our Financial Times described as staggering. What we're seeing, as one commentator has put it, is the entire dismantling of Europe's welfare model in favour of a militarised agenda, scripted in Washington and rubber-stamped by Europe's subservient leaders. We're going to take this on as our talking points this evening, asking such questions as, does the summit expose contradictions between the treatment of Ukraine and Palestine? Were there any splits between NATO member states? Is there anything that it reveals about NATO's current position on China, as well as their current position on Iran? And of course, what can we as meek individuals do to fight against the NATO war machine? Joining me this evening once again is my friend Dr. Pat Walsh of the Irish Political Review Group, and new to our broadcasts, author and journalist up in Scotland, journalist Yvonne Ridley. So first, with regard to this 5% figure of individual nations' NATO spending that they're expected to account for, and how that breaks down. 3.5% of that, they've said, must be allocated to direct defence, while 1.5% can be allocated to secondary issues like cyber threats. Further to that, and importantly, is that any military aid to the Ukraine can be offset against the initial 3.5%, allowing continued funding for the war in Ukraine to be accounted for in this new NATO regime. When Spain and Belgium at the summit pushed to add Gaza to the agenda, however, Britain and the US vetoed this, saying that it was beyond NATO's mandate and would divert focus from the Ukraine. So my first question, therefore, is to Pat. And I want to ask him, are you surprised by this, Pat? Should Palestine be a part of NATO's mandate? And do you find the NATO stance on this hypocritical in any way?
Well, first of all, good evening, everybody. Well, yes, of course, right from the start, we'll learn this later on, that although NATO doesn't seem to be keen to extend its remit to Palestine, it at the same time is extending its remit to both Iran and China through comments made by Mark Rutte in various forums. But anyway, quite apart from that, there's 4 or 5 obvious things to say about the level of hypocrisy here. I mean, the first thing is really about the standard position of NATO in the West about Ukraine, is that Russia transgressed international law by launching a special military operation across the borders. And in other words, it is offending against Ukrainian sovereignty. But there's no mention at all about Israel. Israel at the same time occupies the Golan Heights and has extended its occupation into other parts of Syria over the last few months. not only that, it occupies parts of Lebanon, and not only that, but they're talking about the Gaza Strip and indeed the West Bank occupied by settlers. So there's no talk ever from NATO about illegal crossing of borders or anything like that from Israel. It seems to have, secondly, an elastic right to defence. It can defend itself anywhere by virtually doing anything, breaking all standards of international law, assassinating people wherever it chooses, blowing up embassies, launching attacks, unprovoked attacks on other countries wherever it wants to do that. Obviously, launching special forces, saboteurs, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, across borders, and never any criticism at all about these things. But Russia, at the same time, is not allowed to defend itself in conventional military terms when it has NATO marching up to its border. A third aspect of this is the sanctions. Sanctions have been really extensive about Russia, against Russia from the West, but there's never any talk about sanctions against Israel. In fact, people who even suggest that the US taxpayer shouldn't be funding Israel are usually cancelled or sidelined in some way or other. Fourth issue really is the idea of moral outrage, which was absolutely massive when the special military operation took place in February 2022. It's sort of calmed down a bit since, but in those first couple of months, it was absolutely massive. There's no moral outrage against Israel on the mainstream media, the BBC. Of course, anybody who has moral outrage, the young people at Glastonbury and various other people, other countries that have issued condemnations of Israel, they've been accused of anti-Semitism and they've been cancelled and they've been driven off the airways or not allowed to partake in even entertainment in concerts if they dare mention Israel's name. And then lastly, of course, we have the fact that, NATO itself is divided. Some of NATO members, Turkey, for example, is very much opposed to Israel's policy in Gaza and the West Bank, and has said so. So these are all the sort of hypocrisies that we get from NATO over between Ukraine, its position in Ukraine, and its position on Israel-Palestine.
Thanks very much, Pat. I'd like to bring in Yvonne now on this precise same question and ask Yvonne, what are your thoughts on this attitude that Pat has described? The difference in attitude, even between the direction of the NATO leadership towards Israel and Russia and towards Ukraine and Palestine on the other side?
Well, quite clearly, there's a two-tier policy going on here where unprecedented levels of support are being given by NATO and its allies to the Ukrainians, but absolutely nothing for Gaza. And you have to wonder why. And of course, the why is to do with Israel, as Pat mentioned before. Israel, a land that no cartographer can draw because the borders are ever expanding and creeping into other territories like Lebanon and Syria. We've seen Netanyahu stand up at the UN with his map of the greater Israel. And all of this goes unreported or underreported by the mainstream media. But back to NATO, why isn't it giving the same support to Gaza? Because Israel would not want Gaza to have an Iron Dome defense system like the one that it's trying to sell to NATO countries. I think 3 countries have been duped into buying it so far. And I say duped because the attacks by Iran on Tel Aviv using the 4th or 5th generation missile that it has showed that the Iron Dome leaked like a sieve on certain weapons, which would have caused a lot of angst especially in America, where Donald Trump is trying to do a deal to cover the whole of America with a similar Iron Dome, and he's trying to persuade the Canadians to join in. Of course, the big lie in all of this is that the war in Ukraine was unprovoked. And, you know, there's going to be no fairy tale ending or no victory or no mission accomplished announced by either side over the war in Ukraine. If people bothered to sit down and look at the history, and if the mainstream media bothered to actually go over the history, people would see that Russia is the victim in all of this, because one of the red lines that Russia has made from start to finish, from the days of the old USSR right up to present day Russia, is that it didn't want NATO on its boundaries. And there were treaties signed, all sorts of reassurance given when glasnost broke out, and everybody, you know, there was this global love-in with Russia. They were assured that NATO would not sit on its doorstep. But of course, Russia no longer feels safe and secure now, because Ukraine has said that it wanted to become a member of NATO. It wanted to become a member of the European Union. And it simply cannot end with Ukraine in NATO. Russia has fought the war over that issue. And I remember a few months before the war, Putin was saying that he wanted to talk to the President of the United States. I think it was Joe Biden at the time. And he ignored and internationally snubbed Putin. You know, and he's not the type of guy that you snub. Like Trump, he has his own personal flaws, and trying to humiliate the Russian president was not a good idea, just one of many mistakes made by the Biden administration with Ukraine. And Russia is fighting the war on this issue. It doesn't want NATO on its doorstep, which is not unreasonable. Can you imagine if Mexico joined NATO, not NATO, but joined another country, and suddenly the Russian military rocked up on the border in Mexico? The Americans wouldn't stand it. They would be causing all sorts of problems around the globe over something like that. So Russia is actually not being unreasonable, I don't think, in this stage. The problem is Russia is virtually impossible to read. I remember the night before the invasion, I was interviewed and asked about, you know, the invasion, and I said, it isn't going to happen. It will not happen. And I genuinely did not believe that Russia would finally snap and put boots on the ground in Ukraine. I genuinely didn't think it would happen, but it did. And it caught everyone out. And I don't think that analysts can easily analyze what Putin's next step is. Could this possibly escalate into a nuclear war to avoid NATO enlargement in Ukraine? Hand on heart, I don't think that will happen. But I've been wrong on what Russia does next before. So, you know, this is a really difficult situation. And this is the big lie that the West tells itself, that this war was unprovoked. It wasn't. They deliberately put a stick in the hornet's nest, and now every time they get stung, there's all sorts of fallout from that.
Thanks a lot for that, Yvonne, and welcome to these broadcasts. We hope it's the first of many for you. You might even come to enjoy them as much as I do in the end. My next question actually for you, Yvonne, is why does NATO value Ukrainian lives more than Palestinians? But I think there's a more fundamental question that I'd put before that is, do you think NATO values Ukrainian lives? And if so, what are the value of Ukrainian lives to NATO?
No, they don't value Ukrainian lives. NATO is an imperialistic-driven war machine which doesn't value any life in particular, maybe their own, but they look upon nations as cannon fodder. You know, we look at Gaza every day, and every day we say this can't go on. But NATO just looks the other way. NATO knows fine well that there is a genocide unfolding in Gaza. It's a Holocaust. And if that upsets Holocaust survivors, then I'm sorry. But the reality is there's a Holocaust going on in Gaza, and NATO is not doing a damn thing about it. And it is looking upon the lives of Palestinian people as cannon fodder. And that is the grim reality. And it's, I think a lot of it is based in racism. Nobody cares about all the brown skins that are dying in Gaza, but a bomb hits a hospital in Ukraine, or a child is killed in a missile strike, and it's headline news. It really is double standards all along the way. And, you know, the mainstream media are just as bad. The New York Times has had 26 different editorials or op-eds in its paper that have described the Russian invasion as unprovoked. But they, despite admitting this 26 times, all of their coverage is slanted towards Ukraine. And yet there it is, as plain as everyone can see, that this war and the Russian invasion was provoked because of NATO, or the perceived threat of NATO enlargement. They knew fine well what they were doing. And for any researchers out there, if they go into the Q archives, where the nation's decision makers, all their policies are hidden away in these archives, but they are released, there will be lots of missives from diplomats saying that the red lines for Russia during the Cold War was creeping NATO expansionism. And you know, you look at Russia. It's surrounded at the moment in the Black Sea region by Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. And these were agreements that were signed, I think, by Ronald Reagan at the time, that this would not happen. And yet, as we've seen on the anniversary of the United Nations as well, that America is no respecter of international law, and Ukraine needs to watch out, because America is also not a nation builder either. It doesn't clear up the mess it leaves behind, and we've seen that in Syria, we've seen that in Iraq, and probably 40 other countries it has bombed or invaded or attacked since the Second World War. This is not a nation of peace at all, and yet it is heavily influencing NATO action. And the thing is, it's not just seasoned analysts who can see this. It's people who are becoming increasingly politicized, the anti-war marchers, people who are wanting to know more about, why is this country going to war? Will it affect my children? And you mentioned Glastonbury, 200,000 in Glastonbury were, chanting death to the IDF. And they'll go home and they'll want to look up a little bit more about what they were chanting and why they were chanting. And they'll end up going down some internet wormhole and come up to Ukraine and find out, what is this all about? And of course, it's American meddling again, which began when they pushed the pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, out of office. And that was a decade ago. So ordinary people are becoming more switched on now, and they're beginning to realize that they have to get involved with the anti-war movement or with political parties like the Workers' Party to bring about change. Saying no to NATO is one thing, making it happen is another. There's a lot of fear out there, and we've seen intimidation. The punk duo who led the IDF chant at Glastonbury have now been cancelled. They've had their visas cancelled from the US, which I think makes America look very weak, that it feels so intimidated by the arrival of these two young punk rappers that it has to cancel their visa and the tour. They had a tour throughout the US to look forward to. So, there is a lot of fear. And if they're prepared to do that to two young rap stars, what on earth are they prepared to do to politicians? I mean, we've seen Trump going around strong-arming people in the Oval Office. And that's there for everyone to witness. So goodness knows what went on behind the scenes in this year's NATO meeting.
Thanks very much for that, Yvonne. Pat, I want to bring you in on something that Yvonne has raised there. That is the inability of NATO leaders to properly talk about this genocidal elephant in the room. Now, during the summit itself, not at the summit, but during the time space of the summit, a number of NATO countries did raise the issue of Palestine at side events, namely Spain, Belgium, and Canada. Now, what do you think is the point and purpose of raising the issue in this way? That's for Pat.
Oh, this is for me. Sorry. Well, I suppose, when you think about this, the West has, it has its sort of principles. I know that we might see them as hypocritical, but if it doesn't proclaim these principles and people don't believe them throughout the world, I don't think it's up to much. It's the same as their enemies. So essentially, it's like Russia, it's like China, it's like Iran. From their point of view, it has no soft power, in other words. So the problem lies in the West is that if you're fighting for these ideals, so-called ideals in Ukraine, and then you're fighting on the side, arming, training, giving moral support to a country that's breaking all your principles, breaking international law that you say Ukraine is defending, breaking everything. that you proclaim is dear to your heart, it's pretty bad, actually. It won't be very conducive to Western soft power in the future. So I think these are nations that are worried about this situation, and they want to try to maybe just introduce a little bit of concern, let's say. It never goes any further than that, for the plight of the Palestinians. I mean, what it effectively means is, please, Israel, don't kill as many Palestinians on our TV sets, because you're making life very uncomfortable for us. But that's really all it means. But even that's slapped down, because the establishment seems to fear any criticism of Israel for whatever reason. Maybe we shouldn't speculate why that is, but I think a lot of people know why it is. But I think that's what's behind these pleas in the background, which are just dismissed summarily.
Thanks very much for that, Pat. Now, to speak then about the presence of Britain within NATO. It is, of course, our position in No2Nato that neither Britain nor, of course, any European country need NATO anymore whatsoever. And we are, of course, demanding an exit from this so-called alliance. So what we're going to do now is our dog's bodies in post-production are going to splice in a clip of George talking about stopping World War III at our Elections 2026 Workers' Party rally in London on Saturday.
So if it's a choice between a fifth-generation warplane to fight for NATO or Israel, and decent benefits and houses for our most vulnerable people, then we are unequivocal about that. If we were in power, we would leave NATO, never mind pay 5% of our gross national product to sustain them.
So, back to Pat. Having seen that excellent bit of footage, as I'm sure you'll all agree, question is very basic. What do you think about NATO? Does it help people at all? People construed in the broadest possible sense or the narrowest possible sense? Is it in any way a defence alliance? And if it is, whom is it defending? And what do you think about the possibility of Britain or any other member country of NATO leaving the alliance?
Well, if you think that defence is marching up to people's houses and standing outside them and threatening them with weapons, it is a defensive organisation. I think I remember reading, years and years ago, I was reading a book by Michael Davitt, a famous Irish revolutionary and a socialist, actually. He was a man with one arm. He'd lost it in a factory accident in Manchester. But he wrote a very good book about the Boer War, and he was a supporter of the Boers against British imperialism. And he made that point, actually. He said that Britain defends the British Empire by a bit like the way criminals gather around people's houses with jemmies. And then when the people attack the people within the houses attack the people that are gathering around their houses, they're talked about as the aggressor. I think this is what NATO is, as a defensive alliance. And I think, if we talk about this later on in regards to China and Iran, we'll see that NATO has a very aggressive posture on those two countries, which are completely outside its remit and really have nothing to do with things like Taiwan, have nothing to do with NATO. And yet it seems to have positions and intentions in that sphere, which far go beyond what its usual pretension is, that it's a purely defensive organisation for poor little states on the edge of Europe that happen to lie next to Russia.
Thanks a lot for that, Pat. And Yvonne, what are your thoughts on these questions?
Well, after George's speech, that it is frightening to think that not just us, but podcasts and chat shows around the world are now talking casually about an impending World War III. And that is where NATO has brought us. It is an aggressive military organization. It doesn't help fragile little states. Otherwise, it would have had boots on the ground in Gaza by now. And to help the people of Gaza, you know, they can't even go and get food for fear of being shot by the military, and it's horrific. But I wish the American people would wake up. They're facing austerity round the corner, and yet if they were told that America has spent more than $100 billion to date on Ukraine, a war that it provoked, people would be shocked, and they would be even more shocked if they knew how much of their tax dollars are going towards propping up the state of Israel. And this is why Trump is starting to get agitated with Europe, because he doesn't think that they're paying enough, paying their share towards NATO. Well, I don't want to see Britain end up in a race to the bottom of who can give the most to NATO. But that's what Keir Starmer seems to be doing. You know, you mentioned before that I live in Scotland. We've got an independence movement, and we do not want to belong to NATO. The majority of people who are in the independence movement have got their own red lines. One is get the nukes out of Scotland. As soon as Scotland turns independent, get the nukes out. And the other red line is no to NATO. So, you know, I know that independence for Scotland is a bone of contention sometimes in pockets of England, but we do not want to be paying for endless wars, endless imperialistic wars. We see the need to have a defensive military, a military that would not get involved in aggressive imperialistic wars. And there is no value in being a member of NATO now, because if everybody, you know, it's like when you were a kid in the schoolyard saying, who wants to join my gang? And by the time you'd got everybody into your gang, there was nobody left to fight. NATO it has no meaning anymore. And, you know, let's get rid of it.
So yeah, just to get you a bit further on that the last matter that you raised there with Scottish independence. Now, the intrinsic value or otherwise of Scottish independence notwithstanding, do you think that there would be any worth to Scotland being independent if it were to appeal to NATO membership on its own 2 feet?
Well, the late Alex Salmond did touch on this back in, I think it was 2022, and he said that NATO or the members that he spoke to in NATO said that they would welcome an independent Scotland. And I thought, I bet the bloody would as well, because they, you know, they have a vested interest in Scotland having these nukes in Faslane.
Yeah.
And but in the end, Alex Salmond, he was leader of the Alliper Party, respected the decision of the membership there, that also said no to NATO.
Great.
And as far as I'm aware, that is still the situation.
Great. Thank you very much for clarifying that, Yvonne. Pat, I want to turn to you and ask you a bit about potential fault lines opening up within NATO's European members, because on the one hand, we have European leaders like Orban stating explicitly that that NATO is driving the conflict in the Ukraine. But at the same time, of course, as we mentioned at the start, NATO themselves are now encouraging member nations to account for direct military aid to the Ukraine in their spending totals. Do you think there's anything in the notion that the wheels are coming off support for Ukraine among NATO leaders in Europe, or do you think the opposite might be the case?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me if it wasn't the former, because we've got to remember that NATO is a kind of conglomeration of different peoples. If we look at it, from the start, NATO was made up of 12 nations when it was formed. And then it took on two other ones, Greece and Turkey. I think in 1953 it took them on. So essentially it was made up of 14 nations up to the point of the Cold War ending in 1990. And now it has 32 nations in it. And when we think about who are these nations that have joined it, they're mostly nations that are hostile to Russia. Now, I'm not going to criticize them for being hostile to Russia. There's various historical reasons for this, to do with, historical development, like, for instance, Poland's traditional hostility to Russia. But these are most of the people that have been taken on. If we look at it in a historical context, NATO was made redundant by the end of the Cold War, because NATO was essentially an anti-communist organization, or that's what its purpose was. But what we found out since is that NATO is not an anti-communist organization, it's an anti-Russian organization. It's essentially Russia's the problem, not communism, not the Soviet Union. And NATO's still there. NATO had to reinvent itself in 1990 to justify its existence. And in fact, the first way it did this was by, taking on the Eastern European countries against various, what would we call them, assurances that were given by President Bush Sr. and other people of that time. But it took these people on and extended NATO in 3 waves, I think it was, eastward towards Russia. So obviously it took on a different character when it started doing this. And then the other thing that sort of happened in this part of history as well is that America started its Middle Eastern misadventure, where it started going around the Middle East, smashing up various Muslim countries. And while it did this, it sort of took its eye off the ball in Europe. And during this period, Europe became more, it worked. It had a relationship with Russia. It developed a relationship with Russia, particularly Angela Merkel, who seemed to ride 2 horses at a particular time. And because of the mutual benefit that was gained by both Russia and Europe through energy provision, cheap energy provision, Europe attained not only a degree of prosperity, but a degree of independence from America for the first time in this strange period from from about 1999 to about 2006, 2007, or 2008. So you had this situation, but then what happened was Maidan in 2014, and essentially America was drawn back into the issue again. And the obvious things was the Georgian escapade went off at half-cocked, so to speak, and was a drastic failure. But obviously, the objective was to try to lever either Belarus or Ukraine away from Russia, because these were very much part of the Russian world, and these would be very hurtful to the Russian world. And they knew that was the soft part of Russia that it would really irritate. So America basically managed, or the American warhawks managed to lever themselves back into Europe. Now, So what does all this mean? It essentially means that there is a group of different members in NATO, 32 people, all of rather different complexions. Western Europeans who are not really very enthusiastic about fighting Russia. Eastern Europeans who have been scared silly by the fact that they're up against Russia, and Russia is winning in Ukraine, and suddenly Europe has been found out, and NATO has been found out, and they're starting to raise the hysterical thing about Russian threats and the Russian army ending up in Berlin or in Paris or something. But essentially, they're trying to raise this. So there's a widespread fear, hysterics, and things like this. So it's not unusual. It's not unlikely there's going to be splits in NATO because of this fact that the members are made up of such different complexions, and they are all reacting slightly differently to the crisis that is engulfing them now.
Thank you very much for that, Pat. And I want to conclude then this evening's episode by looking at the two threats which loom behind what we've been talking about so far. That is China and Iran. And picking up on China first, during the summit that was just held, concerns were raised, as they typically have been, about China's military buildup, their role in supporting Russia and their coordination with Russia, and also stronger Indo-Pacific ties. Now, on the other hand, Europe's countries have benefited greatly from Chinese investments, especially through, as you all know, the Belt and Road Initiative. 29 countries in Europe have signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, most of them in the east. Further to that, 32 NATO member states, 12 of which have an agreement with China to be part of the Belt and Road or some other significant project as well. Clearly, those particular states do not feel threatened by China. So the question must be asked, and I'll pick up with you, Pat, first of all, on this. Is the rise of China a threat to NATO, Britain, and the world? And if it isn't, then what is the value in them making it seem like it is?
It shouldn't really be, and I've heard economists say that, especially for the UK, China-UK is a perfect fit because, especially in the electric car manufacturing systems that China has developed, and obviously the push for green energy, etc., etc. Not talking about net zero here. I'm talking about just the obvious thing about saving, the environment and basically having cheaper energy. You know what I mean? So, China is a perfect fit with its technology and obviously also the productive power that it could enable in Britain. It has a lot of things to offer. So I don't think it's a threat. But what we've seen at NATO is NATO in the last couple of sessions, 2024, 2025, has firmly put China in its sights. And I wonder why that is. But if we look back at 2024, I think Biden said, I remember watching his speech, it said something like he described China as a decisive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. He didn't need to do that in a NATO conference, but he went out of his way to do that. And Rutte as well, since Biden's gone, he made the same thing. He's made an anti-China posture part of NATO's remit as well. He's made remarks about Taiwan, for instance. And, Taiwan is of nothing of NATO's business at all. Taiwan is an internal Chinese matter. And yet, Rutte is pontificating about the status of Taiwan and the threat of Taiwan, a threat of China to Taiwan, and the threat of China represents through Russia by arming Russia, etc., in Europe. So it's ridiculous, and it looks like that Rutte is just trying to basically stoke the fires. So, in other words, to try to present another threat in case his Ukrainian dream dissolves and NATO is left with no purpose again. And maybe it needs another purpose. Maybe the defense of Taiwan is its next adventure.
Thank you very much for that, Pat, and for all your contributions this evening. We're rapidly running out of time. I just want to turn to Yvonne and see if we can't crowbar a little discussion of Iran into this conversation as well. Do you think, Yvonne, that Iran was misguided in signing up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty? And do you think that after having seen what has happened to Iran, other countries might be reticent about signing up to similar treaties in the future?
That's a really tough question, because there's another country that hasn't signed up to the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, and that is Israel. And it won't even discuss, it won't even admit that it's got nukes. Although thanks to the heroic whistleblower Mordecai Vanunu, we know that it is a nuclear power. Iran has never shown ambitions to have nuclear weapons. The very first, the founder of the Islamic State, Ayatollah Khomeini, issued a fatwa, and he said that nuclear weapons were evil, and that he wanted nothing to do with them, and that Iran would not be producing nuclear weapons. That fatwa has never been changed, overturned. It's sitting there, and the words of the supreme leader back then, you know, absolutely revered unquestionably. And so I just don't think that they do have nuclear ambitions. Signing up to the NPT, you know, Iran has bent over backwards to try and, I wouldn't say please the West, but satisfy its Western critics, you know, to say, look, you know, this is us, this is what we want. That country has been under sanctions now for over 30 years, and it has a 6,000-year history. America is 249 years old. Israel is 77 years old. They have neither culture nor history. They have nothing. And yet they treat this former Persian Empire with absolute contempt. And really, I would say that both America and Israel need to be sent away to learn how to deal with people. We've got a man in the White House who's acting like a second-hand car dealer, and we've got a man in Tel Aviv who should actually be in court now answering charges for fraud. He's a criminal. Well, he's also been investigated for war crimes. And this is the quality of the leaders that we have. I liked Pat's reference to NATO being a defensive force. If it was a defensive force, it would be a power for good. But NATO isn't interested in defending anything. If it was, it would have sorted Gaza out by now. And ordinary members of the public will start to push, I think, in the next elections, and they will also be saying no to NATO. Why are we paying for it? We don't like it. It's causing wars. It's causing this never-ending war in Ukraine. You know, when NATO got involved, people said, oh, that's it. It'll be all over in a few months' time, and Putin will have a bloody nose. Well, it isn't happening, and there is no end in sight. I said at the beginning, there's no fairy tale ending in Ukraine, and there isn't. And who are the people who are suffering? The Ukrainians, who are being led by Zelensky. And again, the quality of our leaders is shocking. You know, they don't have backbone, they don't have a moral compass, they don't have compassion for their fellow human beings. And people can see this now, and there is going to be such a backlash coming, barreling down the line, because people are awake now. The one thing that Gaza has done is opened our eyes. People are going onto the internet, you know, why are we at war with Ukraine? Why is this happening? Why? And people are waking up. And Gaza might seem as though it's miles away in the Middle East, but it's not. It's on the eastern rim of the Mediterranean Sea, just a few hundred miles further up, and there are people on 18 to 30 holidays, Europeans, you know, swimming in the waters, and everybody is waking up. I had a friend who came back from a holiday in Cyprus, and he said he couldn't enjoy himself because he was looking out to sea, thinking just a few hundred miles away, there's an entire nation of people who are being starved to death, who are being tortured, who are being abused, who are being shot at. And it is beginning to affect people now. And Trump might look at NATO and think war, 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 and dollars, dollars, dollars. But it's going to backfire. Ordinary people, the citizens of this world, can see what is happening. And when injustice is the law, resistance is our duty. And more of us are standing up, you know, like heroic groups like Palestine Action, who break into arms factories and spray red paint. I don't think their red paint has killed a single person yet. You know, their actions, their words have not killed anyone. And the 200,000 kids, the next generation coming up from Glastonbury, will be at their homes now and telling their parents and telling their friends, and the dissatisfaction will spread. And the sooner it does, the better. It's time that we had a people's revolution. So no to NATO, no to Ukraine, and no to futile wars.
Yes, as you say, lions led by donkeys has never been more appropriate, and it is high time that we showed them what lions are made of. I'd like to thank Drs. Ridley and Walsh for their contributions tonight. I'm sure I will be seeing you both sooner rather than later, and I look forward to it. Thanks again, guys. Now, for the rest of you, Dr. Yvonne Ridley will be standing for the Workers' Party as an MSP in Glasgow in 2026. And you can take a look at her speaking at our recent rally in London, just right here.
And then you look at the government. More than half the cabinet is under political occupation of a foreign power. Israel. I live in Scotland now, and I don't want to be controlled by some rogue government in Westminster that's taking its orders from Tel Aviv.
And I think if you've just seen that, then you'll agree that she'll make a fantastic candidate and a fantastic MSP for the Workers' Party in Glasgow in 2026. Now, there are also local elections in England and Wales in May 2026. If you think that you can make a real difference to your community, please apply to be one of the 1,000 Workers' Party candidates that we are seeking to stand in those council elections. So please come forward. You can look at the Workers' Party website, workerspartygb.org, for more details. All right, that's all for this evening. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. And yeah, I'm sure I'll be seeing you again soon, but hopefully Mick will be back with you next week. Thanks, guys.